Questions rise as tensions rise in the Middle East. What happens if President Donald Trump decides to strike Iran, and why? WIFR reporter Alyssa Kelly sits down with a local university professor to answer those questions and learn what the next 2 weeks will look like.
Sydney, the White House says President Donald Trump will decide within the next 2 weeks whether he will order U.S. forces to strike Iran. And Rockford University professor Bob Evans says these next 2 weeks are important to pay attention to.
The stakes are very high. The Israelis will not let this go.
If Israel calls on President Donald Trump to help them, will he strike Iran without congressional approval?
Just time to see whether or not people come to their senses.
Political science professor Bob Evans says these next 2 weeks are important, as sources say Iran is just a few weeks away from being able to use upgraded weapons.
Iran is building a nuclear weapon. Your intelligence community has said they have no evidence that they are at this point.
Well, then my intelligence community is wrong.
Evans says tensions are definitely rising in the Middle East, and the fallout could be extreme.
The Israelis apparently don't have these bunker buster bombs.
Evans explains the bunker buster bombs are heavy bombs used to penetrate down hundreds of feet underground to get to where Iran is hiding weapons.
The Israelis have been able to weaken and injure the capacity of the Iranians significantly, but apparently they can't get to one or two of these deep embedded sites.
And in those embedded sites, the threat is an Iranian nuclear weapon. Evans says Trump seems to want to meet that threat by ordering B-2 bombers.
He's basically threatening them with our response unless they negotiate.
But Evans explains it would not be World War III in the sense of hundreds of troops on the battlefield. It will be one or two planes dropping bombs, and adds the United States is not at war as of right now.
So that would be a more offensive act to world opinion. We would be doing something not covered by the rules of war.
The Republican Party is split, however, on whether or not Trump should involve the U.S. in Israel-Iran conflict.
For decades, Congress and multiple administrations guaranteed billions of dollars in military aid to Israel every year, an amount that skyrocketed since Israel's attack on Gaza.